I've spent 25 years in the data protection game with companies, with trade bodies. I'm now an independent consultant. I'm also on the Ministry of Justice's Data Protection Advisory Panel, where we're trying to work out what the new data protection laws which are coming out of Europe ought to be. I've deliberately tried to have a career where I look at things not only from the policy perspective, but also what you can actually do, what we can actually achieve, how we affect behavioural change. Because I think, as far as I'm concerned, unless we create standards that normal people are capable of understanding and capable of following, we haven't got a hope in hell. I was thinking last night, what hope have I got to get through a presentation on data protection, information security, with a group of experienced and dedicated information security professionals such as yourselves? I was thinking, how bloody minded are they going to get? And I was getting quite worried, because about the last thing I did last night before I went to bed was pop on the internet to see the latest story involving an IT director who has recently been sacked. He's a director of an American community health organisation. The story goes that he was sacked because the board was sick and tired of him complaining about the poor information and data protection security standards that he'd had. He was such a pain in the bum that they got rid of him. When they got rid of him, they wouldn't let him come back in the office, and so they decided to pass back to him all of his digital assets, and they managed to pass back all his digital assets on a hard drive that apparently also contained the details of 130,000 patients with all of their healthcare and all of their financial data. You can imagine he wasn't too pleased, and so he's claimed that this is a security breach. He's so unhappy about this that he's also decided that he couldn't possibly provide his employers with the encryption keys to the cloud storage facility that they've got, which backs up all their records. So it's a bit of a problem. Now then, if we have someone like that in the States, I wonder how much mischief IT security professionals are going to be able to get up to here should their employers be a little bit bloody-minded. What I want to talk first about, really just to get us into the swing of things, is this tsunami that we've seen in technical training. I'm not going to insult anyone by asking if they've read this document, this thing that came out about 2012, only 20 pages long. If you want to try and remember what it looks like, it was the one that had the 10 rules for sort of good information security practice as a jigsaw puzzle. That's basically all you need to know about that, and I think that we'll find that the advice which comes out is just sort of rehashed again and again and again, and so let's not bother about that. Let's think about the last bit of advice that came out, which was just a couple of weeks ago. I don't know whether very many people have seen the assurance framework that's recently come out on the Cyber Essentials scheme. A couple of documents up there, 10 pages long, a quick summary to let you know what it's all about. There's the light blue thing, about 14 pages. It's all about an assurance framework. The brightest of you will say, Hoskins, you're not earning your money. There weren't two, there were three. And you're right, there was a third one. This is the requirements for basic technical protection from cyber attacks, only 17 pages long. I'll refer to bits of it later. I suppose the underlying message is going to be that the more the authorities pump this stuff out, the more the organisations are expected to have constructive knowledge of what it is they're supposed to do, and therefore the more glee the regulators are going to take by shaming people that haven't followed this stuff, which has just been going around and around and around. I don't know how effective, to be honest, this latest proposal is going to be. I hope it's slightly more effective than the last initiative which came out. If anyone can remember February this year, a couple of days before Valentine's Day, we came out with the Cyberstreet Initiative, which was basically nuggets of guidance to help SMEs. There's a problem, I think, in the way organisations pump out their security guidance at the moment. I've seen that myself when I was working closely with URIM, which is now called the Digital Policy Alliance, and when I was doing some work with the Information Assurance Advisory Council and the Technology Strategy Board. There's an awful lot of technical policy wonks out there creating their own initiatives. There's not an awful lot that's joined together. And it's really, and I found over the past few years, it's really, really difficult to get people to act in a joined-up way. The Digital Policy Alliance tried to create a roadmap which would show which organisation was responsible or associated with what particular bit of the cyber assurance security field. They failed dismally after about 3 months because the spreadsheets just got too big and everyone just kept on changing their roles. I think there's a real problem, I think, that we're all facing when most of us are getting sick and tired of the different sorts of advice, and lots of people just want to be told what to do. Give me something simple that I can follow, and then let me hope that I can follow it slightly better than some of my competitors. But I really want to concentrate more on stuff that's much closer to my heart, which is about what might happen when the regulators get involved. What role might they play? And hopefully, by the time we stagger out for lunch, we'll all have a better idea as to the role that the ICO currently plays in assuring the public that the information management standards are robust. I'll explain a little bit about what it does in terms of examining public authorities and other organisations. I've been involved with ICO audits for both public authorities and for communication service providers as well. Under the PECA, the Privacy and Electronic Communication Regulations, the ICO has the power to inspect and audit the security controls that the companies have got. It's a painful task, preparing your company for that sort of stuff. I absolutely respect the dedication that everyone's got, the professionalism that everyone's got, and the extent to which everyone is struggling to get stuff right and get stuff done in an atmosphere where the organisation is facing a whole range of other priorities as well. My aim here is not to criticise anyone, although I will, in a minute, be showing how the ICO has named and shamed various organisations. And perhaps should this speech be broadcast wider, I might need to redact some of the names that are going to be used to protect the poor innocent buggers. Anyway, where do we go? The concept normally is that for the past few years the ICO has been keen on audits. It's been keen on audits basically because of the approach that Richard Thomas and the latest Commissioner, Christopher Graham, have taken, which is basically people cannot just be encouraged to do things. We've almost got to shame people into explaining why they haven't done things as well as others. When I started in the data protection world, I remember working closely with the Bank of England and the Home Office on the implementing regulations for the 1998 Data Protection Act. None of us talked about audits at that stage. For us, it was going to be a result if we could encourage some organisations to issue things like privacy policies. It's just amazing what's happened over the past few years. And as we look into the future, what's likely to come down the road? What's likely to come down the road is a new principle, one of sort of accountability where organisations have to be far clearer about the controls they've actually got in place to safeguard personal information and probably other business assets. And not only have they got to be clear about the controls they've got, it looks as though they're being asked to be clearer about the way they audit those and what they do about the failings that they come across. If you want to know very much about the ICO's audit process, you will find that they keep the audit manual, the questions, very, very close to their chest. They really don't like to share those. What they are good at, though, in their audit reports, which they publish on their website, and which some public authorities very helpfully publish on their website as well, is that you can see from the comments that they've made about the audits, you can work out pretty easily what the questions were in the first place that prompted that. So a lot of us have got a pretty good idea as to what it is they're actually going to ask. The bad news from the ICO then is that they've got an audit team and they're active. The good news from the ICO is that budget cuts mean they're not as active as they could be. But the not quite so good news is that if the government is going to be successful in its transparency agenda and its accountability agenda, it'll be putting more pressure on organisations to carry out their own audits and to publish their own audits. God help us at the moment. It's difficult when we look at the ICO's website to find very much specific about universities. You would have thought that there might be something on their page, schools, universities and colleges. And is there anything? No, there's not. The only time that universities is mentioned on that particular bit is in the bloody title. It's crazy. You would have thought that their webmasters would be a little bit more proactive about making it easy for data protection professionals or other security professionals to navigate their way around. It's difficult, for example, to realise that just a couple of years ago, they produced a report on the audits, the self-audits that a number of schools carried out, some 600 schools, completed questionnaires, which went back to the ICO. They had a good look and they groaned. There is a problem at the ICO at the moment. The problem is it's not quite sure how to deal with the fact that there are an awful lot of poor performers and that there are an awful lot of poor performers in the public sector. Does it name and shame these poor performers, or does it accept that there are real problems with budgets and that they're doing the best they can? When we look at the advice that comes out in their reports, it's very much Janet and John. Simple words, simple terms. And this can be misleading sometimes. When you look at stuff that's published by their policy team, it's all quite high level. Very, very different from the expectations of their enforcement division and their audit division, who seem to require a much greater level of granularity of care. So strategically, I think, fairly soon, the ICO is going to have to be more forthcoming about just what standards it expects people to follow. It is doing that, and I want to show how it's doing that soon. When you look at the advice, say, that it's given to schools, it's all absolutely Janet and John. If you look at the nuggets of wisdom, say, on security, keep confidential information secure when storing it, using it, and sharing it with others. I mean, you would have thought it's almost insulting for teachers or for data protection officers to be expected to get stuff like that. But the reason they're getting stuff like that is because it's simply not happening at the moment. in the schools. The other advice that they've got when we look at, say, CCTV, inform people what it's used for and review the retention periods. There's not an awful lot there. You've really got to search much harder to find what the ICO is really after. Those that are really nerdish will realise that hidden away on the ICO's website is a page and a section on audits. And this is the area that I suggest we look at, because it's clear, or it becomes clear when you read it and when you speak to people that have undergone security audits as to how they do things. Audits, you will find, are almost used as a Trojan horse by the ICO to come in and have a good look around in particular areas. And while I appreciate that there are a lot of dedicated information security professionals here who are happy about the controls that will happen within the IT sphere, take it from me, that's not all they're looking for. They are going to come in and they are going to take at least, say, 3 subject areas out of the 6 that they possibly could. While you may be lucky that your IT security might be in reasonable shape, you may well have problems in some of the others. Where do we go? What do they look at? The critical areas that they're looking at, and the areas that I'm going to come back to for the next half hour, are what they do as far as ensuring that we've got good standards of governance, that there's training and awareness, that there's records management in place, that there's security in place. But look, that's just one of the bits. That in various inappropriate organisations, the requests for personal data or requests under FOI are dealt with appropriately. And finally, that data sharing arrangements are good. Now, you may be happy about what happens with security, but remember, they might only spend 1/3 of their time on security. That means they can spend 2/3 of their time finding fault with the other aspects. We need to be careful. We need to be very careful here, and I think we need to remind our chums in the rest of the business the extent to which they may be exposed. Let's concentrate first on governance. It's keen on the concept of governance. The ICO is getting sick and tired of finding silly issues, simple things that have gone wrong, and when it asks the seniors within the organisation whether they knew or whether they cared, they find that basically it's not something that affects their board at all, it's not something which attracts their attention, it's something they can delegate to others. The ICO is keen to try to ram this up the corporate and the political agenda. If we want to know what governance is, the extent to which data protection responsibilities, their policies, their procedures, what performance measures and controls, what reporting mechanisms you've got in place in order to satisfy the board that the organisation's assets are being appropriately looked after. They get financial reports. They know what happens to an awful lot of the property that an organisation has, physical property. There seems to be much less focus at the moment on the board caring about the IT assets, the intellectual property, and we'll see where we go from here. Now then, the lovely thing about the ICO is that its audit reports have some useful stuff about what they've found. Now, when you are asked to do an audit, or to be subject to an audit, you have a choice. Of course, you've got to say yes. But you have a choice about the audit report that they produce. If you want to, you can allow the ICO to publish the executive summary on their website. If you're a bit embarrassed about what they found, you can object. to the executive summary being put on their website. So what I'm now about to show you, of course, are the quotes from those organisations that are happy that the ICO publishes the executive summary on the website. Okay? And if we think, if this is the good stuff, I wonder what the others can be. So what does it look like? Every now and again you get phrases. At the time of the audit, the Information Governance Management Framework was disjointed. Governance being provided across a number of functions, overseen and scrutinised through a number of different meeting forums, without any standalone information management board. So there's a risk that senior level ownership and accountability for compliance and the risk mitigation strategies aren't in place or cohesive. Bugger. Another one they come across. There are no terms of reference for the Senior Information Risk Officers Governance Board, and there's no corporate governance framework for records management, and as such, no clear line of responsibility from the board down for records management issues. They're happy to allow this to be published. Another organisation that was being audited was happy about being acknowledged for the fact that they haven't established any key performance indicators to be used for measuring compliance with the DPA. Senior management haven't got any oversight of compliance regarding areas of information risk, and there aren't any KPIs in relation to records management or any other method of monitoring compliance with records management. Another one, and this audit was last year, there's been no auditing of data protection compliance since 2006. I mean, if this is the good stuff, you begin to think, my God, what must the bad comments be like? Let's move on. Training and awareness is an issue that they are often keen to look at. What do we mean by training and awareness? Let's be clear, we are not, at least the ICO, doesn't really want to teach people or expect people to be taught about bloody data protection. Employees aren't supposed to know about registrable particulars or about how trans-border data flows are supposed to be performed appropriately. No. What is it about? The provision and the monitoring of staff data protection and trainers and the awareness of the requirements which relate to the staff's roles and responsibilities. In other words, the whole concept is that we don't just give them a lecture on data protection, we tell them how to do their job. And we just focus on the important bits as far as their job is concerned. The way this is being increasingly done in some companies is to get staff to sign something called statements of compliance. In other words, not just to go through a test where they're expected to get 80% at the end of it, but to be capable of signing a series of simple statements which can be used by the HR team to hammer them should something go wrong. Simple statements like I always encrypt my data. I don't share confidential business information. Or I don't put confidential business information on my personal electronic equipment. That I regularly change my passwords. That I don't share my passwords. Simple statements of compliance. I know how to report data breaches. I know where to get further training on data protection. I know what an information security policy looks like and where to find it. Simple stuff. But the critical thing is that they can then be used by the HR teams to take disciplinary action against staff who have willfully ignored the standards which have been properly explained to them and they've acknowledged that they're capable of adhering to. That's the aim. When the ICO has a good route around, what does it find? Sometimes it's unclear within an organisation who currently has overall responsibility for the entire end-to-end training process, and for mandating any improvements in data protection training. Okay? When it went to a local police force, what did it see? There's currently no mandatory data protection or information security refresher training in place for any staff or police officers. In addition, temporary and contracted staff and volunteers aren't required to complete any training. And whatever the training there is, isn't overseen within any information government framework. You can simple stuff, pretty basic stuff. And when you think that this is the sort of stuff that's going on even within police forces who may have been audited before, it's not the first time that they would have received an ICO audit. But for stuff like this to crop up again and again and sometimes again on the websites is embarrassing, basically. Where do we go? Records management. Records management, I accept, is something which is difficult and something that a lot of us are struggling with. The concept of records management, however, as far as the ICO is concerned, is actually quite critical. What does it look for? What processes has an organisation got for managing not only the electronic records, but also the paper records as well? Who is it who's responsible for deciding how these records are created or maintained or stored or moved or destroyed? The thing being here is that if there isn't anyone responsible for these sorts of things, then they don't necessarily get done. It's sometimes useful to have someone who's responsible for what they're calling information assets, in order that that person can be consulted on how long those records need to be retained, on who should have access to it, on how frequently they should be weeded, on how quickly they should be destroyed. It's relatively simple stuff, but the problem is that it's also difficult stuff as well. None of us here really want to take responsibility for records. Lots of us are happy to take responsibility for the electronic protections that go around the records, but very few of us really want to say, I own that particular piece of information. So we're left often, all too often, in organisations where there are lots of people that share this information, but very, very few who are actually responsible and whose head is going to roll when something goes wrong. And the ICO is quite plain. This is a board responsibility. The board has got to delegate this to people. If the board hasn't delegated it, then the chief executive has got a problem. What does it say when it audits records management? Often you're going to get, there's no corporate records management strategy. Nothing at all to do with roles or responsibilities and policy, procedures, training, monitoring and reporting was in place. When it went along recently to South Wales Police, what did it say? South Wales Police doesn't currently maintain an information asset register for both electronic and paper-based records. They actually can't confirm what paper records are currently being retained by the force. And although they've got this concept of information asset officers, because it sounds good and it sounds sexy, they don't take responsibility for any paper-based records at South Wales Police. Okay. Now, again, these are the organisations that are happy for the ICO to report on what they found. Are there any other places where there are good news? Let's try West Midlands Police. There's no local inventory of paper records. Previous reviews of West Midlands Police premises have uncovered a large number of paper files in unknown or incorrect locations. A recent outcome report arising from one of these reviews has raised this fact, has not been investigated further, and hasn't been escalated as a security incident. There is a system available for staff to update the records, or the whereabouts of any paper records, but the use of this system isn't mandated or monitored. Bad news. I think one of the reasons they wrote that, and they published that, was because of a case which was going on behind the scenes that none of us were allowed to know at the time that audit report was passed. And this, what we weren't allowed to know at the time, was an incident involving a breach relating to the Department of Justice in Northern Ireland. They have a compensation agency. A couple of years ago, their compensation agency was required to save costs. It saved costs by moving premises into cheaper premises, and to save costs, it auctioned off its spare furniture. It invited the auctioneers around to have a look at the tables and the chairs, the old filing cabinets. They were duly appraised, valued, and auctioned. At the auction, someone bought an old filing cabinet, broken, you couldn't get in it, actually. Spent about 80 quid on it. Person who bought it took it home, thought it was a bit heavy, broke the lock, realised that this filing cabinet contained official papers from the mid-70s to 2005, containing lots of privileged ministerial advice and also papers relating to compensation claims of a number of terrorist victims, including how much the Northern Ireland Compensation Authority was happy to award them in compensation. So, for the privilege of auctioning their filing cabinet for about 80 quid, they were fined £185,000. Pretty good. You sometimes think, what is it that organisations, if they're getting rid of assets, don't do simple things like open them up and find out what they've actually got. Reminded me of an audit report that they were talking about another police force. I think this was Cambridge, but I'm not too sure, where they were talking about a large backlog of paper crime files due to a decision to cease processing in the wake of the Bursars inquiry. You may remember the Bursars inquiry came after the Soham incident, where it was clear that police files, confidential police files, weren't necessarily following people of interest as those people of interest moved around the country. I was also reminded of an incident, and I think it was Kent Police earlier on this year. They vacated a police station. The person that bought that premises found a nice old box of VHS tapes, which contained a load of interviews under caution. And he had a great time sort of looking at that. You sometimes think some of this stuff is so simple, so stupid, how do people get away with it? We just think there, but for the grace of God go I. Okay, let's move on from records management, because that's difficult. Let's look quickly at security. Oh, we like security. The technical and organisational measures in place to ensure that there is adequate security over personal data held in manual or electronic form. What effectively this means, when we look at it, if you want that unpacked, when the auditors come along to audit your security arrangements, they're going to look at these when the auditors come along, they're going to look at these areas. Yes, they're going to look, the big thing about network security, but they're also going to look at physical security, at your mobile media, at home working, at staff monitoring. They're going to look carefully at who's responsible. If you want the questions that they are going to ask, I'm sure they can be provided to you. You'll get my email details later. The ICO gets sick and tired of publishing report after report on the latest thing that's gone wrong, things what not to do. I don't know if how many of us read eagerly the 46-page document that came out from the ICO just a couple of weeks ago, Protecting Personal Data and Online Services, Learning from the Mistakes of Others, created by Dr. Simon Rice, who was only recently, when I say recently, in the past few years, he's joined the ICO as their technical bod and is now trying to create a little bit more technical help and technical guidance. If we look at this, what do we find? You know, we almost yawn when we open it. We can predict what they're going to say. And I'm sure if I was to ask people if they knew what their top 8 vulnerabilities were, they would all come out as well. You know, the failure to keep the software security up to date, the lack of protection from the SQL, the use of unnecessary services, the poor decommissioning of old software and services, insecure storage of passwords, failing to encrypt online comms, poorly designed networks, continuing use of default credentials. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. A lot of this stuff was repeated in the latest Cyber Essentials document. I don't know how many of us have read it and digested it. If you want to have a look at it, I referred to it earlier. There is a small document talking about what requirements for basic technical protection from cyber attacks we actually need to put in place. And when you read this, you groan. None of it is new. None of it is earth-shattering. It's just frustrating, I suppose, as to how many times we have to remind people. But the critical thing is that the more times now the businesses are being reminded about this, the more the regulators are arguing, hey, you now have constructive knowledge of what it is you're supposed to do, what safeguards you're going to put in place. And so when we come along and we audit you and we say, have you done this? Have you done that? Have you done the other? When we start saying no, then we're going to have a pretty convincing answer to the next question, which is why. What are these looking at? Very briefly. Cyber Essentials, it's again looking at boundary firewalls and internet gateways, secure configuration, access control, malware protection, patch protection. I mean, none of this is going to come as a surprise to anyone who is competent about IT security in this room. If we flick through, you'll see the level of detail that they go through. If we look, say, at boundary firewalls and internet gateways, load of stuff to look at. Bog standard things. Look at the bottom bullet point, for example. The administrative interface used to manage boundary firewall configuration shouldn't be accessible from the internet. I mean, none of this is a surprise. If we look at secure configuration, if you want these slides, of course, I'm sure they'll be available afterwards, but they're also just taken from that book. But if you look at secure configuration, third one down, unnecessary software should be removed or disabled. Bog standard, absolutely bog standard stuff. If we go down to malware protection, look at the fourth bullet point. Admin account should only be used to perform legitimate administrative activities and shouldn't be granted access to email or the internet. None of this ought to be that difficult, but it obviously appears to be sort of sufficiently challenging to enough organisations for the authorities to have to keep on sort of hammering this stuff home. Their wise words about malware protection. Bottom indent would probably be useful for you. The malware protection software should prevent connections to malicious websites on the internet. In other words, using website blacklisting. How you use website blacklisting in an educational environment like this, bearing in mind the challenges that are faced by our clientele, are interesting. You know, they really are. And so, and I suppose we sometimes think just how carefully have the auditors created these standards? Are they actually fit for purpose or not? They look great, but can they work? This is where I hope that there might be a bit of a pushback later by the professionals, the people like yourselves, to be able to explain how, in so many circumstances, they don't work or they can't work, but what other compensatory measures there are in place to try to catch the real miscreants. And the last one that made me laugh Well, they're careful words on patch management. And if you look at the bottom bullet point, it's brilliant. All security patches for software running on computers and network devices that are connected should be installed in a timely manner within 14 days of release, or automatically when they become available from vendors. I've worked for some large, very large organisations where it's taken 6 or 7 or 8 months sometimes to sort out the patching. 14 days is absolute nirvana. But I suppose if nothing else, at least if there are standards like this, organisations can more carefully explain to their seniors the extent to which they can't comply with these standards, and then the organisation can take a proper managed risk assessment and accept that as a particular risk. The ICO normally has a field day when it looks at security in its audits. WMP, is that West Midlands Police, doesn't have government protected marking scheme, policy or guidance. It hasn't got a confidential waste policy. It hasn't got an information risk management policy or an information management policy. And the information security policy and the records management policy are all outdated and require review. Brilliant. This is something that West Midlands Police are proud to let everyone know about. Not pleasant. University of the Arts, London. There aren't very many educational institutions that have so far had the pleasure of being audited by the ICO. But I imagine from the wry smiles around the audience that many would sympathise with the UAL for getting caught out, for being told or for being discovered that there aren't any audit checks. Sorry. This one. That University of the Arts have got a large number of remote users accessing their networks and applications, many with bring your own devices, but remote access authentication doesn't meet industry good practice standards, and there aren't any systems to ensure BYOD compliance. There, but for the grace of God, no doubt, go all of us. If these are the issues which are going to come up, soon we're going to have to think of some credible explanation as to why that is the case within your particular organisation. And that's, if nothing else, that's one of the messages that we've got to go back. We've got to think, if we know what the questions are, then how are we going to create a coherent answer? Very briefly, because I've been asking you to sit down for far too long, requests for personal data is something that they look at every now and again, subject access requests. And what are we talking about here? The process is in place to respond to any requests which mean for you, not only subject access requests, but also FOI requests. What help does the ICO give you? Gives you, if you want, another bloody book to read. There is a code of practice produced in February, 58 glorious pages, lots of white space, but 58 glorious pages of stuff to read. And so having read that stuff and having complied with all that stuff, you won't get caught out as other organisations have got by not having any centralised records of subject access requests, or no reporting to any central points. All the SARs being held and dealt with locally, not following a set procedure, not having logs to indicate which lawful exemptions you've used to withhold information. Brilliant. If that's what you want, absolutely fantastic. Last one, data sharing. Data sharing is something they're getting increasingly interested in. What I'm talking about as far as data sharing is concerned is where we've got the data controllers to data controller relationships and data controllers to data processor relationships. It's looking at the sharing and the operation of controls to ensure that whatever goes on complies both with the principles of the DPA and also the recommendations set out in the ICO's data sharing code of practice. My God, you say, another bloody book. to read. Yes, another bloody book to read. This one, you'll be delighted to know, is only 59 pages long and was issued last May. But again, the same, and sometimes quite with some credibility. We're trying to give you the guidance. We're trying to explain what you need to do. Now, if you don't do it, there's going to be a bit of a problem. Now, you are going to look rather embarrassed if you continually don't do what has been explained to you in pretty rudimentary terms. You therefore won't be in the position of an organisation called Devon Doctors, who recently underwent an ICO audit. Devon Doctors doesn't have a central log of all of the contracts it has in place with third parties. We're certainly not carrying out any compliance checks to ensure that their data processors are complying with any contractual requirements or any other bit of the Act. And although they've got some data sharing agreements in place, a number of them are out of date and they're not effectively monitored. I think we just say there, but for the grace of God, go I. We are offering the auditors open goals. None of what I've said is particularly difficult to achieve. It's just embarrassing. It's just nice to snigger when you realise it's Devon Doctors and not Merton College or another college. Would be nice to snigger if it was Oxford, but it's not. Okay, what happens then? Got to be careful. Once the ICO's got you in your sights, and once we've failed the audit, guess what? They're back in 18 months to do it again. And then in a year's time, they're back again to do it again. It's the gift that keeps on giving as far as the regulators are concerned. So once we've had the first audit, there will be invariably a series of follow-up audits. When things go wrong, there is a suite of things that could happen. If we're lucky, our seniors will just be required to make voluntary undertakings. I promise I'll do better. I promise that I will get more training for staff. I promise that, or I undertake that 85% of my staff will be trained within the next 3 months on data protection principles, and that they will, and that 50% of them will achieve a pass mark of more than 65%. You know, that's the sort of thing that they're looking at. If you don't like the concept of a voluntary undertaking, then David Smith can do the next thing up, which are the enforcement notice. The enforcement notice is embarrassing. It's more formal, and it comes normally with a slightly longer ICO press release. Remember, every time that the ICO issues a voluntary undertaking or an enforcement notice or a civil monetary penalty, it will publish those details on the ICO's website, and it'll be up there for 2 years. Then a load of other privacy wonks will take it from that website and they'll put it on their own website, so effectively it's going to be up there forever. I've been involved in a couple of incidents where I would very much love to have the right to forget. It's not going to happen. Once we mess up, it's there for an awful long time. Where do I leave you? Are there any common refrains which are coming through? There is a common refrain coming through, and it comes from statements like this that I saw just a couple of weeks ago. Our audits of state organisations have in too many cases shown scant regard by senior management to their duty to safeguard the personal data entrusted to them, a duty that's all the greater because of the legal obligation to provide such personal data. Laudable objectives such as fraud prevention and greater efficiency must meet a test of proportionality in the manner in which it's used. Critical issues. Failure to treat personal data with respect can only lessen the trust that should exist between the individual and the state, and it will also lead to more formal enforcement action by my office unless system-wide action is taken to improve current practice. Doesn't sound like the ICO. That's not the ICO. That's Billy Hawkes, actually, over in Ireland. There is a campaign by regulators all over Europe now to realise that compliance is a bit of an issue and that they've got to start taking this data protection malarkey a little bit more seriously. We will await the ICO's publication of its annual report. If anyone wants to go along to that in about 4 weeks' time, we'll see what the ICO is going to be saying about the state of compliance. Where do I go here? I suppose the critical thing, as we're sitting down thinking, how does he wind up, is how much do we actually care about this? Do we take the lead just from the regulators, who don't have very much in the way of resources? Do we hope that this happens to other organisations? Do we hope that the senior management of our own organisation is so preoccupied with other issues it doesn't see this as a priority? Or do we try and do something about it? I'm not sure. What I can tell you from my work at the Ministry of Justice is that the new data protection regulation is expected to herald this new principle of accountability. And the principle of accountability is one where organisations will have to be capable of showing how they meet the DPA requirements. What they're almost suggesting is that rather than wait for the ICO to come along and audit organisations are going to have to self-audit themselves along the lines that I've already sort of pointed out, and then make those results available both to the ICO and to the board and to the customers. Now, we know to a reasonable extent what questions are going to be asked of the organisations. The problem, like everything, is trying to create credible answers that are good enough to assure our management, our customers, and the wider world that we do take data protection sufficiently seriously. I know that everyone here is desperately keen to try to get it right, and there are people within the audience, no doubt, who are going to be able to help with some of the technical controls that are necessary. The critical thing is we know what the questions are going to be. We know what they're going to find. Let's hope that when they come along and knocking at your door, that the audit results aren't going to be as horrendous as some of those that they've already seen. I've said enough, basically. If you want to get hold of me and if you want to ask me any questions, send me an email wrapped around a bottle of gin to info@martinhoskins.com, and we'll see where we go. But I think that's it for the time being. Please.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.